If I could get your attention, please. Tough crowd. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our last speaker. We've saved the best for last, is that right? We said that to Kelly, but we'll say it again for Greg here. Greg Fleming joins us as the CEO for the Maxim Institute, located in beautiful Auckland, New Zealand. The Maxim Institute is an independent research and public policy think tank committed to the people, land, history, and culture of New Zealand. The Institute works in a number of policy areas, including marriage and family, civil society, government, as well as the need for personal character and responsibility. Greg co-founded Maxim with Bruce Logan when John Graham, then the Auckland University Chancellor, challenged him with a question that I think is really important and one that I think we should take to heart as well. The question was, what are you doing to shape the future of New Zealand? In our case, what are we doing to shape the future of Canada? I think that's a really important question. 10 years later, Maxim has been a significant influential contributor to New Zealand's public policy debate. In 2005, Greg was one of 6 New Zealanders to receive a Sir Peter Blake Emerging Leader Award from the Sir Peter Blake Trust for his outstanding leadership. I think you'll see why in a few minutes. Maxim has also been the recipient of several awards, including 3 Templeton Freedom Awards for Institute Excellence, Social Entrepreneurship, and Initiative in Public Relations. He's also been a recipient of the Sir Anthony Fisher International Memorial Awards, where recognized a series they did called the Parents Factor in the Innovative Project category. He's here with his wife, Kirsty. Welcome, Kirsty. He's a father of 5 children, and it's my pleasure to welcome a friend, a colleague, and a fellow traveler on the policy road. Please welcome Greg Fleming.
Thanks, Jay. Thank you very much. It really is fantastic to be here. I was getting excited for a moment. I thought you said you guys were all going to take on the challenge of asking what you can do for New Zealand. There's so few of us down there asking the question. That is leaning to the right, isn't it? But that's okay, as long as it's not leaning to the left. Okay, so I have photos. Can you see that? That is our 5 kids. It's a little red, isn't it? So we've got Toby on the left pulling a face, Willis, Annabelle, Harry, and then Jed. That's about a year ago, and it was taken at my wife's younger sister's wedding. Kirsty's the second of 5 kids, and there's a big age gap between the oldest and the youngest. And Toby, pulling the face, was the page boy, and there he is there with his cousin. And I put these photos up there after Jonas showed photos of his family, and I thought I'd better do the same. And then the reason I put that in there is because I remembered the reason I used that previous photo was this is the last decent family photo that we've got, even though it was taken like 13, 14 months ago. And it reminded me of the fact that that day, Toby was so taken with the whole wedding ceremony that he took the wedding planner aside, the person who was managing the church, and said to her quite earnestly, was he able to bring Lily back and marry her in a few years' time at the same place? So he's getting the message of marriage. Now, to ensure that I do stay to time and make concisely the points that I want to make, I have actually drafted my talk out. So I prefer to speak more from PowerPoint slides, but in the pursuit of precision this afternoon, I will stay to my notes. I just wanted to say this is our first time to Ottawa. Kirsty and I have had the good privilege of being in Western Canada before, but we've never been to this city, and it's great to be in the capital of a fellow Commonwealth nation. Observing the 24-hour coverage by the US networks recently of the royal wedding, it's made me wonder if your southern neighbours are actually pining to be allowed back into the fold. I wouldn't suggest it. They brew lousy tea. Now, whilst New Zealand was one of the last British colonies to fully acquire independence, we were pretty slow off the mark on that one, we have often been at the forefront of change. In 1893, we were the first nation to give women the vote. In 1938, one of the first to introduce a comprehensive welfare state. In 1939, we were the first Dominion to declare war on Germany. And in 1984, we were one of the first to declare a nuclear-free zone. We have a rapid history of uptake of new technologies, or a history of rapid uptake, indeed, of new technologies, facilitated in part by our small educated population, excluding, of course, the majority inhabitants, our 43 million sheep. They're cute and woolly, just not so smart. My pet lamb, Flopsy, excluded, of course. Now, there are just 12 universities, 2 news networks, 320 high schools, and 1 House of Parliament. Legislation passes very quickly, and new ideas ferment rapidly. When it comes to family life, this has meant some notable law changes have been forged in recent years, and that's what I'm to reflect on for the next half an hour. Specifically, I've been asked to speak to you about New Zealand's decriminalisation of prostitution in 2003 and the banning of spanking, or as we call it, smacking, as a form of child discipline in 2007. And whilst these 2 issues grabbed the headlines, there have been other less debated changes during that same decade that arguably have had a much greater impact on family life. For example, the Property Relationships Amendment Act of 2001 began to treat de facto relationships when they break up the same as marriage dissolutions. Now, like most law changes, it was trying to address some practical changes for individuals, but in the process it served to further encourage the view of marriage as just one relationship choice amongst many. The pragmatic decisions that we make in forming legislation will always have deeper origins and broader consequences than we tend to realise. And I would suggest that underlying the legislative and policy changes that I wanted to discuss today is an idea that has long been shaping New Zealand's culture. And it is the notion of the free and isolated individual as the basic unit of our society, with consequently the family too often viewed as subservient or incidental to the individual. My colleague and good friend Paul Henderson spoke to the history of these ideas in his lecture to the inaugural IMFC conference in 2006. His excellent paper is available on the IMFC website. So I won't repeat that detail here other than to note that the ideas of Rousseau, Kant, Dewey, Foucault and others have been absorbed deep into the New Zealand psyche and significantly shape our view of what it means to be human. And that view is the liberated, unrestrained individual free to create his or her own truth and to choose whatever he or she wants in pretty much any context. As part of our work, I often have the chance to speak with high schoolers and university students and explore with them the ideas and stories that underpin their approach to life. We use the term worldview or framework. I often note that if you want to hear clearly with ideas, which ideas and beliefs most resonate with a society, then you need only tune into its advertisements. For a marketer's very existence depends on their ability to tap into the soul of potential consumers. And even a cursory glance at our screens will show which story most dominates. And so, given it is late in the afternoon, I have a couple of video clips that I would use with these high schoolers. The first is advertising an open polytechnic, a type of technical university in my home city of Auckland.
Your world was once a small one. As you grew, it did too. But now your world is bigger than it's ever been, and it has no boundaries. We are no longer limited by tradition, language, or distance. What was once fixed is fluid, and there's no one path. We work more jobs, learn more skills, and share more ideas than ever before. And we don't have to stop our lives to start new ones. When we understand this, our world is infinite. Everything's possible. Everything's open.
It's very compelling, very subtle, very, very appealing, and I enjoy unpacking some of its more nuanced messages. The second one is a little more bold, a little more amusing too. It's from Vodafone, which is one of the 3 main telecommunications companies that we have in New Zealand.
Isn't the world a great place? I mean, just think of all the things we can do now. You can change the colour of your hair, your skin, and even your eyes. You can have a virtual pet, an online friend, a second life. You can become a millionaire by selling pixels for $1 each. You can go back to school after you've retired. Men can stay at home and look after the kids, while women go to work and bring home the bacon. If you don't have boobs, you can just go buy a pair. You can dial a hubby. You can get donuts in 564 different flavours and entertain the whole world from your living room. Now we can do all these great things, so let's make the most of it. Vodafone, make the most of now.
In fact, we could spend a whole day just on Vodafone adverts. They're absolutely fantastic in terms of the way that they read the culture and tap into this desire. Certainly, and I know that this is a desire that is common around the Western world, but one of my suggestions today is that it's particularly pronounced in New Zealand, and the reason I'm raising it is because I want to reflect on the role that that has played in much of the legislative change that has happened in New Zealand over the past decade. Because I would suggest that it is this view of life where humans are atomised consumers and choices have few, if any, consequences. The second part's very important. That permeates and dominates every part of New Zealand culture, including family life. Several years ago, my younger sister Julie was travelling a very difficult road in her first marriage. The pressures of young children and a struggling business were sapping the life out of that relationship. She had very supportive neighbours, and our immediate family was offering a great deal of support. Practical, emotional and financial. Those little platoons of support, the institutions of civil society, were responding just as they should. There were understandably many tough days, and my father and I would often receive calls from Julie where she would explain that the cupboard was literally bare. One day, instead of calling us, she took the advice of some friends and visited the local government welfare office. Work and Income New Zealand are there precisely for situations like this one, and they were eager to provide her with practical help. However, the manner in which they provided it was extraordinary. After hearing Julie's story, and obviously she was at a very low point that day, the welfare officer advised, "We're going to give you enough money so that you and your 2 sons can leave this marriage and set up your own life. You can then find someone who will make you happy." Julie noted to me later that it wasn't just the officer who was dismissive of marriage, that in a room full of brochures on how to negotiate divorce and single parenting well, there was not a single one on marriage counselling or keeping a family together, not one. And the conditions around receiving the welfare benefits that flowed after that initial interview strongly echoed this approach. Julie and her husband quickly discovered that they would receive significantly more finance if he moved out of the family home, which he did. He would come back regularly and at times even stay over, but he needed to make his official residence somewhere separate from the family. The tax-paid welfare system was literally encouraging them to model separation, which of course soon became permanent. Now, given that benefits have to be income tested, I can understand practically how this situation has arisen, but the attitudes of both the office and the officer echo the prevailing assumption within our entire system, and that is that people consume relationships. That is their choice, there's nothing really wrong with it, and we need as a society only to alleviate any consequences. Yet, as IMFC regularly publishes, and we've heard today, social science data overwhelmingly shows the very opposite. In fact, there's perhaps no other area in social science in which the evidence is so clear. Stable, enduring relationships matter enormously. Our choices do have profound consequences, particularly on our children. Now, in the paper I referenced earlier, Paul Henderson explains how the shift in ontology and epistemology has brought us to a place in New Zealand now where even the practice of objectively reading data is not free of contention. I recall being in a TV debate some years ago about the place and importance of the marriage relationship. During a commercial break, one of New Zealand's leading professors in this area of work turned and said to me, "Greg, you refer frequently to the importance of family structure. Yet my recent meta-analysis shows that family form has virtually no impact on children's outcomes." I was speechless for quite some time. That was early on in my work at Maxim, and it was formative in shaping the manner in which I now engage in public debate in my country. Not for one moment have I given up on hard data. For example, one of our recent reports challenged and had some effect in encouraging the government to engage in more rigorous measurement of family intervention programs. Our claim was that they weren't measuring enough. They weren't taking the data seriously enough on the effect of these programs. But I am now realistic about the degree to which people's beliefs are shaped by experience far more than facts. Some of us were talking about this earlier this morning. It's fair to say that the most perplexing challenge for us as an organisation these past 10 years has been how to convince politicians and policymakers to accept a law or policy position that runs counter to their view of the world, of freedom, of justice and of compassion. And often, most fundamentally, their view of what it means to be human. And this challenge was particularly pronounced in the debate over prostitution. As indicated earlier, New Zealand decriminalised prostitution in 2003, and with Canada considering apparently a similar move, you're interested in hearing about the great Kiwi experience. Well, there is to date very little reliable data available on the impact of the legislation. As Brad said to us, it's taken 25, 30 years for us to fully understand the impact of divorce. I dare say it'll be the same on prostitution. In fact, in that case, Sweden has some far more established evidence in terms of their decriminalisation of Sweden 35 years ago. But we do have a lot of anecdotal evidence in New Zealand, of course, from both sides of the debate, which I'll refer to in a moment, along with some very recent polling done by a friend of mine just 2 months ago on New Zealand's attitudes to prostitution and how that is and isn't changing. But first, let me provide some history to the change and some reflections on the debate that ensued. Prior to the law change, prostitution was illegal but readily accessible. Under the Massage Parlours Act of 1978, brothels existed in practice but not in name. It was the police who effectively regulated the sector by exercising discretion as to when and where they would conduct raids on these parlours. Likewise, street prostitutes were committing a crime, but as long as they stayed in certain areas, the police would most often choose to turn a blind eye. When debates arose over the potential decriminalisation of prostitution, there were those who, because of this context, supported decriminalisation while not regarding prostitution as a desirable practice. They didn't see the act and industry of prostitution as inherently violent and dangerous. Rather, they believed that it was the absence of health and safety standards and access to employment rights that was the real problem. If we fixed those, then everything about the industry could be okay. There were, of course, other advocates who held a more radical view. They genuinely believed that prostitution was an industry where both workers and clients could conduct healthy and helpful transactions. They argued strongly that the negative aspects, the violence, the depression rates amongst prostitutes and the exploitation by gangs, were primarily the result of society stigmatising prostitution. The two MPs most vocally in support of the proposed law change regularly portrayed the industry as one where women could flourish and where clients could have their vital needs met in a healthy way. I remember one of the MPs proposing it, saying that his vision was to see chains of brothels up and down New Zealand. I guess we're on the way to that. The bill decriminalising prostitution was introduced to Parliament in late 2000 and passed its first reading with a substantial majority. It made a slow passage through Parliament until the July 2002 election, after which the Select Committee in the new government processed final submissions and then recommended the bill to Parliament. It was in those final submission stages that we at Maxim Institute were invited to become involved. We had only existed as an organisation for 11 months, and the highly contentious nature of that bill thrust us into the headlines. It's interesting to look back on those days and think how different things might have been for us as an organisation for the last 9 years had that bill not been around. A year later, we found ourselves again in the spotlight as we debated then civil unions legislation. We were supportive of addressing anomalies in relationship law, but we opposed the further watering down of marriage. Of course, that nuance was overwhelmed by the emotion in the debate, and within a couple of short years we found ourselves publicly defined by two very contentious and labelling issues. For the 6 years since then, we've worked almost entirely on education policy, foreign aid, constitutional matters, taxation, family support programs and welfare policy. But often we're still defined by those 2 early years. And the reason I give this history is to make a couple of points. Firstly, for those individuals and organisations that are looking to engage in your looming prostitution debate, consider very carefully how and why you engage. And secondly, be aware of just how deep are the prior philosophical commitments of the groups who care about this issue. The understanding of the very nature of prostitution, what it assumes about humans, sex, choice, power, compassion, relationships and justice is where the real debate needs to be had. Unfortunately, we seldom got to that ground in New Zealand. We certainly didn't get to that ground in our House of Parliament, where it was a last-minute impassioned speech by a transgender former prostitute MP that arguably swung the final few votes. She told a very personal story of being raped as a prostitute and being unable to go to the police because of the criminalisation of the industry. In that moment, the understandably emotional call for access to the criminal justice system trumped all other matters, including that of the much broader understanding of even justice itself. 2 Libertarian MPs, and interestingly New Zealand's first Muslim MP, were apparently swung by the speech, and the bill sneaked across the line 60 votes to 59, with 1 abstention from the Muslim MP. As I mentioned earlier, although it is difficult to concretely measure, anecdotal evidence indicates that prostitution and the challenges of brothel locations, street workers and underage prostitutes have increased rather than decreased since its decriminalisation 7 years ago. New Zealand's model of law change effectively saw central government wash its hands of the problem, while at the same time tying the hands of the local government councils by giving them only the power to regulate where brothels can operate. In practice, this only means preventing them from operating in areas that are particularly sensitive. Subsequent court rulings, the courts have got very active on this one, have made it clear that local councils are not to use this regulatory power in any way to ban brothels. It is only there, they say, for the purpose of keeping them away, for example, being immediately in the vicinity of schools and churches. They say that suburban brothels is what they believe the government intended to be the norm when it passed this legislation. Understandably, the headaches are now numerous, including prevalence of street workers, battles over zoning of these residential brothels. Seldom does a month go by now without some headline detailing a brothel being found by a school gate, or yet another local council wrestling with zoning challenges, not being able to do what it wants to do. One of the more recent high-profile cases was of a brothel setting up in the Prime Minister's neighbourhood. Another was the prevalence of street workers in Christchurch suburbs after the earthquake had shut the central city, including their usual pick-up areas, and the outrage from the residents, who were then, as they saw it, being invaded by the word they used, skanks. As part of the legislation, a review committee was established, and in 2008 it reported back to Parliament on the operation of the Act. 11 of the 12 government-appointed members were supporters of the law change, and hence, unsurprisingly, given my earlier observations about epistemological objectivity, they concluded that the law was working fantastically. Equally predictably, the 12th member, a friend of mine, formed a different view that was grounded in her experience as an outreach worker to street workers and her first-hand experience of the Act's effect. The police themselves commented in 2009 that they had observed an increase in street workers, including the number of underage prostitutes and increased gang activity. Perhaps not surprising, given at the time of the law change, the President of the Police Association summarised his view as, and I quote, "Decriminalisation means cops out, crims in." A couple of years ago, a friend of mine in the neighbourhood asked for some advice on how to deal with a brothel that had just set up on his street. He was sufficiently resourceful and networked to mobilise community pressure such that the brothel soon shut down. The same end usually meets most brothels that hit the headlines, but despite the law supporters' hopes that decriminalisation would change the community's attitudes, the majority of people retain the NIMBY approach, NIMBY being not in my backyard. Polling in March of this year had the following results. In answer to the question, should the prostitution laws be amended to specifically ban brothels in residential areas, 66 said yes, and 26% no. And should street prostitution be banned, 50% said yes, and no said 33%. The lowest support for such a ban was from males, and from those males and females aged 46 to 60. Encouragingly, in terms of those of us who are still committed to seeing a law change in the future, and that is what Sweden has done after many years of having a legalised system. It has criminalised the Johns, or those purchases. Encouragingly for us, we see that 64% of males and females aged 18 to 30 supported a ban. So the next generation coming through seem to be more realistic about the damaging and the inherent destructive nature of prostitution. In Manukau City, the prevalence of street prostitutes in one of the main commercial and retail areas caused the council and local MP there to petition Parliament for extended powers. What they explicitly asked for was the right to ban prostitution in certain areas, and a bill to that end was introduced to our Parliament. With the recent merging of Manukau City into the other 3 cities that previously comprised the Greater Auckland area, the bill has been renamed the Auckland Bill and has been ratified by the new council. Now, the council has to jump through some procedural hoops, but once they're clear, the bill will be back before our government's select committee, with deliberations scheduled to finish this September. If the bill is passed into law, then with such powers given to what is now by some measure New Zealand's largest district, it's very likely that similar powers will be sought by other councils around the country. In other words, I think this issue is very much still live. Like all such law changes, the majority of the proponents were, as I described earlier, well intended. They believed that allowing women to freely make the choice of prostitution was the best way to assist them. But in that approach were 2 significant assumptions. Firstly, that the women involved were genuinely making a free choice, and second, that the exercise of that choice would have no wider consequences on others or on society as a whole. I argued at the time, and I still do, that both of these assumptions are deeply flawed. Research is clear that for the vast majority of women, it is precisely a lack of choices and support that drives them into prostitution in the first place, and that the consequences of prostitution are considerable on the woman, on the buyer, and on the wider community. When a society decriminalises something, it is in effect saying that it no longer considers that activity to be problematic. That, I contend, is one of the reasons why we see more underage people going into prostitution. Sex is officially just another commodity to be traded, and there are no consequences attached. Such a move is consistent with what I previously observed regarding the elevation of self and choice above all other considerations in our society. But we're not always in such denial about the wider impacts of our private decisions. Ironically, this has all occurred at the same time that tobacco smoking has been very effectively hammered through continual legislative policy and taxation changes. As one commentator observed, it's now okay to buy sex, you just can't smoke afterwards. In closing this part of my talk, I would add that the inherently destructive nature of the sex industry isn't solved simply by resisting legislative change, any more than it's solved by decriminalisation or legalisation. Whenever law is offered as a thin solution to a real social problem, the challenge for those of us resisting that law is also to find ways to offer other forms of hope in the debate. This is obviously easier said than done, but it is an important road to walk. One example is a work that I have the privilege now of chairing in South Auckland. It's a charitable trust named Te Whakaora Tangata, translates from Maori, who are our Indigenous people, as a restoration of the people. And as its name suggests, it is informed by an anthropology that sees humans as relational, priceless, and redeemable. 2 months ago, we began working with a lady who has 14 children from different fathers and been a prostitute for over 25 years. She is now off the street and off methamphetamine, but only because she is now surrounded by a genuine community who are committed to her and her children's welfare and restoration. No amount of criminalising or decriminalising can affect such change. Just check I'm going for time. Yep. Close time is 4 o'clock, isn't it? 4:30? No, but I finish at 4. Is that right? 10 after. Ah, the second contentious. Did you understand that first part? Shall I reread it? Okay. The second contentious piece of family-related legislation in New Zealand that I'm to speak about is the criminalisation of spanking, or smacking, as it is called down under. When I first wrote that first sentence in preparing this talk, I read back and realised that I had, carrying on from the prostitution section, my mind was so there about decriminalisation that I had written decriminalisation of spanking. Ironically, with the passing of these 2 pieces of legislation, one form of spanking has indeed been decriminalised. Greg, I hear from Andrea. Greg. In all seriousness, these 2 changes within the same decade offer a fascinating insight into some prevailing ideas in New Zealand culture. I flippantly referred to the broadening ban on smoking in New Zealand that has been advanced on the grounds that some personal choices should be curbed because of the unavoidable consequences of those choices, both on the individual and, in the case of passive smoking, others in the smokers' community. Prostitution, however, is viewed in a different light. It is apparently an activity whose consequences can be alleviated or even removed. At the very least, in New Zealand, choice trumps consequences. Clearly, there are much deeper assumptions at play here. I'm well aware of that, around the nature of humans and sex, but the point around human autonomy is nevertheless an important one. It's one of the reasons why the mission statement of Maxim Institute is to foster the ideas and leadership for a more free, just and compassionate New Zealand. We constantly come back to the nature of freedom, of justice and compassion. For our understanding of those three terms, and critically the anthropology that informs them, will very much shape our entire approach to policy and culture. There we go. At Maxim Institute, we run residential internship programs twice a year, and MPs regularly come and hold extended and very open conversations with the interns. We're very fortunate. We get senior ministers, and because of our mixed member proportional representation system, we have a number of political parties, and all the parties are happy to send representatives out there, and they enjoy engaging with our bright young things. In February of this year, one current minister shared that his ultimate vision for society would be anarchy. He was quite serious. As a committed libertarian, he genuinely believes that it is governmental restraint that most stands in the way of true human flourishing. Implicit in such a vision is a very hopeful and positive view of human nature. Whilst I'm persuaded by the benefits of smaller government, I can't share that same utopian ideal, I guess, which is one of the reasons why I'm a political conservative and not a libertarian, at least defined in New Zealand political vernacular. Our assumptions around human freedom, and I use this word assumptions because in most cases our belief systems, our worldview goes uncritiqued, are critical to how we approach such legislative questions, and this point was amplified during New Zealand's extended and ongoing debate around spanking. As with the prostitution debate, there were some admirable motivations to those seeking a law change. Our country has a lamentable record of child abuse, one of the worst in the developed world, and people everywhere are desperate to see it addressed. The MP who sponsored the smacking bill, as it was known, Sue Bradford, genuinely believed that it was our defence of parents spanking their children that fostered a culture of violence. She could not see any difference between spanking and abuse, and she consistently and persuasively argued that children should be protected from assault, just as adults are. The second part of that sentence is crucial. Throughout her political career, Sue, I call her that because we became friends who have a great deal of respect for each other, we just disagree on pretty much everything, was fuelled by a commitment to advancing the rights of children. Significantly, she saw children not primarily in the context of their families, but rather as mini adults who needed to be empowered in much the same way as women and racial groups had been liberated in the past. I was aware of this when Yona said this morning, quoted the leader of their Social Democrat Party saying it is the right of children to go to daycare. That is very much the language we have in New Zealand. I find it particularly interesting given that for 9 years in New Zealand, just about through almost the entire first decade of the century, our Prime Minister then, Helen Clark, was very much a disciple of Sweden. One of those parts that suited her framework, certainly the ideological framework. In fact, you may encounter her at the United Nations work. She's now number 3 in the United Nations, actually, so a very, very influential woman. This was a view shared implicitly or explicitly by many other MPs and advisors. Hence, during that same decade, there were also calls, thankfully unsuccessful calls, for the lowering of both the voting age and the age of sexual consent. My former colleague Dr. Michael Reid authored a book for Maxim in 2005 titled From Innocence to Agents. In it he chronicled the growth of the child's rights movement in the Western world and looked particular at some New Zealand applications of those ideas. I want to quote him now. He said, "For much of Western history, children have been considered in the context of the family, which has provided for their support, protection and care. But in the later decades of the 20th century, children moved from being viewed as innocents in need of protection to being politicised agents with autonomous rights guaranteed by the state. Together with a new balance between local and international law, the state has shifted from supporting the authority in place of families to supporting the emancipation of children from their parents and the support structures which make for their well-being. I can see someone writing that down, so I'll leave that up for a moment. One of Michael's case studies was the debate around Section 59 of the New Zealand Crimes Act. That part of our law that provided a defence for parents against the charge of assault if they spanked or smacked their children. Now, in order for that defence to succeed, the defendant had to show that A, the force used was reasonable, and B, that it was for the purpose of correction. At the time of writing his book, the bill to repeal Section 59 had just been introduced to Parliament. In fact, I remember my then 7-year-old son, Harry, he was the eldest one in that picture before, saying to me, because often I'd come home from work moaning about the legislation that we were battling at that time. He said to me, "Oh, Dad, is the government introducing yet another bad law? What's it this time?" I replied, "They want to make it illegal for parents to spank their kids." Harry gleefully exclaimed, "A good one at last!" He reminds me regularly of this new law, and we'll actually see some stats around the number of kids that are doing that. In critiquing the proposed law change, we argued that parents should retain physical authority over their children. With assault defined as an intentional application of force or a threat to apply it, that's legally what it means in New Zealand statute, the absence of the defence would clearly present a challenge for parents. For instance, even enforcing time out would technically be a crime, because you would, in most cases, have to restrain the child into placing them into time out. That would be assault against an adult were you to do the same. There is no longer a defence against assault. You would now be committing a criminal activity with no defence. In the previous 15 to 20 years, there were a handful of court cases where it is arguable that defendants were able to use the defence where they shouldn't have been. You can argue that the jury or the judge got it wrong. Now, these cases were obviously highlighted frequently by the law change supporters, who also misrepresented the facts of other cases, and in some cases overemphasised the facts of those reasonable cases. And we argued for an amendment to tighten up the law to reduce the likelihood of improper cases, yet still allow parents to give their children a light smack, and critically to retain physical authority for parents over their children. The proposed legislation was a private member's bill, not a government measure, and thus, like the prostitution law, it made very slow progress through our Parliament. The public debate was heated, protracted, and the lobbying from both sides was intense. On the eve of the final vote, it appeared that the bill would likely succeed, but that Parliament would largely divide along party lines. And this was important in that it gave the bill's opponents, like ourselves, some hope that even if the law passed, the issue could be relitigated at the upcoming general election that was just a few months away, and then likely repealed by an incoming Conservative government. However, in a surprise move, the then leader of the opposition, now Prime Minister John Key, met with then Prime Minister Helen Clark and agreed a late-night amendment to the bill in return for the full support of his party, all MPs, regardless of how they personally felt. Up to that point, it had been a conscience vote. The amendment simply stated that the police would have discretion not to prosecute parents if doing so would not be in the public interest. In essence, smacking would be illegal, but the ban might not be enforced. The bill thus passed with an overwhelming majority, including the support of all the whipped Conservative MPs. Smacking was out, but whipping was okay. I didn't get a Greg that time. Opponents of the new law soon embarked on a citizens-initiated referendum and secured the necessary signatures. It was only the 4th time in New Zealand history that that's been successful. The referendum was held 6 months into the term of the new government, led by the now Prime Minister John Key, who had reiterated his enthusiasm for that new law. The referendum returned a result of 87% support for decriminalising smacking. But within hours of its announcement, the Prime Minister ruled out any chance of a law change. So the referendums are not binding in New Zealand, only indicative, but clearly the indication couldn't have been much more pronounced. It was indeed an interesting time in New Zealand politics. We didn't really know where to go after that. Since then, Polls have continued to show similar levels of support. In the most recent one in March of this year, 82% of parents responded yes to the question, do you think the new law should be changed to state explicitly that parents who give their children a smack that is reasonable and for the purpose of correction and not breaking the law? It was almost exactly the same question as the referendum, showing that public sentiment is really not changing. The same poll also for the first time explored what impact the law change was having on parents. And in answer to, has the anti-smacking law made you less confident as a parent when dealing with unacceptable behaviour from your child, 21% said yes, which surprised me that it was that high that quickly, given that it's really only been a couple of years. And interestingly, to the question, has your child ever said that they would tell the authorities like a teacher, social worker or the police if you smacked them, 32%, nearly 1/3 said yes. Some of them may have been in jest, like my son, or like all my kids regularly do. But I fear that most of them were not. One of our intern alumni from Maxim Institute is currently completing her Masters in Social Policy and will then very likely convert it to a PhD thesis. Her thesis is presently examining similar questions to those questions there, those second two there. She's looking at the effect of the spanking law on New Zealand parents. Her full results won't be available for several more weeks, but in reading last week through her draft summaries, it's clear that some, if not many parents, are finding their confidence eroded by the new law, and many don't understand what the law actually says. They just really feel at sea as to terms of what they can and can't do with their children, which is what we argued when opposing that law. What I find particularly curious about the politics of this law change is the degree to which the same government that doesn't seem to make the slightest policy announcement without rigorously poll testing it displays on this issue such resolve in the face of overwhelming public opposition. On the downside, I suggest it illustrates just how deeply held are the ideas which have shaped much of our social policy in recent years. But on the upside, it illustrates that lurking within the timid, poll-sensitive shadows is perhaps sufficient political courage to make some of the changes that my country so urgently needs. One of the hopes currently fermenting in New Zealand is a program of social delivery called Whanau Ora. It came about as part of the coalition negotiations between the national and Maori political parties after the 2008 election. In essence, it is a devolving to the community level the delivery of various social services, and at the heart of it is a belief that primary relationships are pivotal. Whanau Ora literally translates as family health or family strength. In contrast to most of New Zealand culture, our native people have never accepted the story of individualism. Indeed, it's anathema to their whole framework of life, where the individual only finds their identity in the context of their whānau, their extended family, both living and generations past. Tradition, knowledge and understanding are not created anew by each generation, rather they are treasured and passed down through the ages. Now this can obviously be taken to extremes, and at times this one glory creates much trouble for New Zealand. But in essence, I do see it as a real light ahead for New Zealand. A fortnight ago, I met the kaumātua, the elders of the Manurewa Marae, which is now housing the frontline social work that I mentioned earlier, the Te Whakaora Tangata work. The first third of our meeting was spent on sharing our stories, our family's journey, explaining our home and our primary relationships. The marae, a Maori meeting place, is owned by the community and not individuals, and our whole conversation was around how our shared work can restore and support families. Ironically and sadly, the present social statistics on family are far worse for Maori than for other people groups. But I observe that that is not a consequence of a changed anthropology. They are very clear on what it truly means to be human. Rather, they are struggling with intergenerational cycles of family dysfunction. But there are clear reasons behind that I do believe can be addressed. We have the right foundation to start from. Hence, approaches like Whanau Ora and at a micro level, Te Whakaora, implicitly recognise that the only way to break those cycles is to reinvigorate the health of the family, focus on restoring relationships, and have those who know and love the individuals be the ones to deliver that support. Such a countercultural approach in New Zealand could realistically only be forged by Maori. As our first people, their beliefs and values in the 21st century are held in the highest esteem. For example, grace is seldom now said at official ceremonies. But karakias are a common feature of public meetings. A karakia is simply a Maori prayer. Maori know far better than the present dominant culture that no man is an island. They have the stage to advance that, and they have clearly signalled that we need to follow policy directions where families and communities are strengthened. Their leadership in the area of family policy is, I believe, one source of real hope in New Zealand. Wes and I were talking last night about strategy. He works for the Manning Centre, and he was saying one of the questions that they regularly ask the people that they're training to consider is, who is the best spokesperson for this? And inherent in what I've just laid out there is very much our answer that we believe the Maori people are the ones to take this countercultural approach forward. For several decades now, the story that has most shaped my country's culture and policy has been that of the liberated individual, unfettered from the claims of family or neighbour. But I genuinely believe that that story is beginning to unravel. There's a dawning realisation of the link between that story and the endemic fracturing of families and relationships. I see it in conversations with high school and college students, in the unguarded remarks of media commentators and academics, and in the candid reflections of a few courageous, only a few, but they are there, political leaders. Now, this story won't unravel quickly. After all, its roots go back 400 years, but unravel it will. In spite of the direction of New Zealand policy and legislation these past 10 years, I have real hope for our country. And I look forward to, 20 years from now, New Zealand being used by Canada as a model rather than a warning. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Greg. It is interesting and challenging to hear how another nation, we heard from Sweden this morning, New Zealand this afternoon now, how they are grappling and dealing with some of the social issues that they are facing and we in turn are facing in similar or sometimes dissimilar ways as well. It's a challenge to us, and it's very interesting to hear how you face some of those issues right now. The microphone is open. We do have a few minutes for questions here, and I would encourage people to take the microphone, and we'll hear from Greg as well.
Or we can go to afternoon tea early. I said so much.
I know, you said it all. I have one question for you while people are thinking of their questions, and that is, we've heard some of these stories as being negative, the downside. What are some of the upside stories that you can point to at this particular time? What are some of the positive things going on within the structure of family?
I do see, as I said there in my closing comments, I do see signs of hope. The trends in terms of rates of marriage, for example, are beginning to stall. I was interested in who was it that spoke this morning who actually showed was it Brad this morning who showed the tapering off of marriage, pointing out that there is a ceiling at which things do seem to taper off, and I think New Zealand has probably hit those. I think in many of our social statistics we're probably ahead of the curve, but I think I can report some good news of saying that the curve does taper. That has been perhaps our experience. As I say, I think for me the biggest hope is the role of leadership and the attitude now being taken by our native people. And probably the biggest hope for me is this fact that you now see it in the next generation that are coming through, and the people in their late teens and the early 20s, that they are pausing to say, hey, the story that we've been following doesn't look like it ends well, and we actually need to find another narrative. But that is the challenge for us, I think, is to propose this alternative narrative for them, perhaps even more importantly than it is to show them the correct graph or data set.
So how is the anti-smacking law actually functioning now in New Zealand? How many cases do you know about when the police could have laid charges but refrained? Yep. And in how many cases have they actually laid charges? And if you know, if the numbers are known, and what is the attitude of the population? Yeah,
well, firstly, in terms of the numbers, there's been around about 300 cases, I think, at the last count, that the police have investigated. Yet, to my understanding, I think fewer than 30 of those have actually gone to court. There have been the first successful prosecutions over the last 12 to 18 months. I think, to mind, about 6 parents so far have actually been convicted and sentenced on those cases. And most of those cases, a couple of them that are pretty clear-cut, that weren't good, but they would have been caught under the previous law anyway. But the other cases are very much in dispute. And in fact, advocacy on them continues around, basically saying that the courts were far too advocacy-based in pursuing the judgment that they returned. The biggest impact on New Zealand so far seems to be, as indicated by the statistics, is either the loss in confidence or the loss in clarity of parents towards what authority they now have over their children. But I don't. So far, we haven't seen the police running completely amok.
Yeah,
I was wondering, what would you recommend for parents in face of the spanking law? How do they deal with that? How should they best deal with it? And I believe the Bible has something about spanking, not using a stick bigger than your finger or something like that. Now, how does the Christian parent deal with the law like that?
Well,
I guess we need guidelines.
Sure, yeah. And in this, my answer here may well vary for a number of people in this room. I'm actually reasonably ambivalent about whether parents are able to spank their children, and I say that in two regards. So, my reading of that particular scripture is that it can just as, if not even more accurately, be translated as meaning a guiding rod rather than an implement for striking. My concern is not so much that parents retain the right to be able to, for one of a common term, to strike their children. My observation in running a parenting organisation for a number of years before we started Maxim Institute is that there are plenty of other methods of discipline available to parents, but rather that nearly all of those methods still require the parent to have physical authority over their child. And the exercise of any one of those elements of authority under New Zealand law now would qualify as an assault against which there is now no defence in a court of law. So in answer to your primary question as to what do I now say to people, I say take comfort in the fact that you are one of the 85% of parents who still think that you should have physical authority over your children, and rest assured in the case that there simply aren't enough law enforcement officers in this country to radically enforce that law if they choose so. So that our present Prime Minister, is a fundamentally decent and good man, and I have no doubt that he believed that he was doing the best thing. He was wanting to balance a very contentious and heated debate with the genuine concerns of some people that smacking and abuse were interchangeable and indistinguishable, but at the same time realising what the vast majority of parents wanted, which was protection from the law. He genuinely believed that what he proposed was getting that balance right. With the greatest respect to him, I think he was naive, I think he was incorrect, and I think that even just the few cases we've had to date have indicated that fact. So my advice to parents is carry on with what you're doing, and trust in the fact that probably in the foreseeable future we will see the law amended so that it's not making such an ass of itself. Thank you.
I have a sort of a supplementary question. So the police now are in a position to lay charges, but are not supposed to or are allowed not to do that if it is not in public interest.
That's correct.
So question number one. Is that not a power that actually belongs to the Parliament, public interest? And B, how do they define the public interest when they deliberate?
Answer to the first one is yes, and second one is they've handed it to the courts, and the courts now have to decide on the merits of each case as to how they're going to rule, but primarily that power is now exercised by the police. So it's you've now got this policeman who has no such education and usually very little life experience to be able to make that sort of judgment, and yet it is they that are deciding whether the charges will be brought. And this is the key point. The harrowing process for the parent begins at the moment that they are arrested whether they're actually prosecuted or not, and this is of dozens of the 300 cases that have been brought so far, the parents have reported back and said it was the case itself that was completely harrowing. It was almost like by the time they got to the point of whether they were going to be convicted or not, it was almost beside the point. By then, the family had already been disrupted, and the mental and emotional anguish that they had gone through. So it's a very, very poor piece of lawmaking. And interestingly, most authorities, most legal authorities in New Zealand advised against it as well. It really was nothing more than a political move. But as we heard from Jonas today, political ideology runs strong in many Western countries.
Has anybody suggested that this is an anti-democratic precedent, actually?
Oh, very much so, frequently. Particularly, you can imagine the heat and the emotion that was around after the referendum result was announced, and yet, as I say, literally within hours, it was slapped down. If I can use that term. I think slapping's still allowed. I don't know. Slapping and whipping, not spanking.
Wes.
Greg, I think you mentioned in 20 years New Zealand will be different, right? You're hoping so. What are the forces of change that are going to make it different? You argued the First Nations there, young people, parents who actually don't believe in a law like that. What other forces of change are going to be required to make that change?
Intentional, strategic, determined planning, fostering the ideas and leadership for a more free, just and compassionate New Zealand. We are a small country. We have only 4 million people, and as I said in my introduction, changes happen very quickly. For the last 10 to 15 years, those changes have all too often been in a negative direction. I believe that with the right people committed together for the long term, sharing those ideas, poring over them, critiquing their own assumptions, and committed to that common cause, we can see the change about. And now I sound like I'm doing a promotional course for Maxim Institute, but that's what we're doing. And so please, if you ever come down to New Zealand, come and visit us, and we'll show you firsthand some of the work we're doing.
Last question.
Oh, okay. I had mentioned before, I'm not sure if you're here, so I'm a pediatrician that works in Ottawa. And so I think, and I also work in global health. And so for 21 years ago, when the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child was proposed, and many countries are signatories, I think its original purpose was really to protect children, you know, in developing countries and situations of war and that. And then you alluded, I was very interested in the quote from the book, how that's being twisted, right? So that instead of, you know, protecting children, that their basic fundamental rights like shelter and food and that sort of thing are being threatened. It's augmented, and I think it can be pervasive at the UN and in UNICEF too. You alluded to downstream from the smacking law, changing the age of consent for sexual activity, and one other thing.
Lowering the age of voting.
Right. So did that go through, or can you expand on that a bit?
They both fell by the wayside, thankfully. Yeah.
By the same groups of people, or
they were promoted by the same political forces that successfully promoted the two pieces of legislation I highlighted today. Yes, they did, and I don't think that sort of drive will go away. But for now, the real impetus behind that has waned. We do have different political forces at play in New Zealand now, but certainly the United Nations Declaration on the Child continues to hold particular sway in our public sector in New Zealand, and as you say, it is unfortunately being twisted, because most of that document is very admirable, and certainly its intentions were wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you, Greg. Will you please join me in thanking Greg Fleming one more time?